As Maura said, I'm Mary Behan. I work in the IT department in Kildare County Council, and I'm just going to share with you our involvement in an EU-funded project for e-invoicing in local government, and I suppose what we've done in Kildare on our e-invoicing journey since then. So we were involved in an EU-funded project with two other local authorities, Fingal and Monaghan, along with the LGMA and Sligo IT. And I suppose where we fed into that project was firstly to come up with our semantic data model for invoices in local government. So what were the data fields that were going to be needed on invoices for them to be compliant? The other part of the project was how the integration would work with our financial management system, which is Agresso. And for ourselves, sorry, I haven't started my slides here. To represent local authority, the local authority perspective. So we wanted to go a bit further than compliance, and we wanted to end up with something that would allow us to integrate e-invoicing into our existing financial management system, so that we weren't running two systems or having to use different processes for electronic invoicing than we were for our paper invoices. So at the start of the project, there was a lot of conversation around our size, so what fields were going to be needed for an invoice to be valid. So we started with the PEPL standard and looked at all the data fields on that and where the differences might be, and what our requirements were. We talked about whether we would need a separate size for purchase orders and non-purchase orders, so those utility invoices. And how could we how could we see that an invoice was valid at the earliest opportunity, so that those checks, if an invoice was incorrect, was sent back at the earliest opportunity, rather than spending time it getting to a certain stage and having to send it back. We also spent a lot of time talking about the intricacies around RCT, VAT and PSWT, something I knew nothing about before this project started. We were hoping that there were ways that we might be able to automatically check to see if RCT invoices were valid, or if withholding tax should have been included on an invoice. So on the integration side with Agresso, we talked about how those invoices would be handled, at what stage they'd come into the existing workflow, and how much validation could be done or would be done without anybody having to look at the invoice, and what manual checks would still need to be carried out. And of course how our error handling would work, so that invoices weren't getting lost in a dead end in the financial management system, that somebody would be notified to go and look where there were issues. And then the other side was the non-PO invoices. So I suppose that's where we see that we can really get benefits from e-invoicing, because the volume of our utilities is very high. So I suppose just to give a bit of background on invoicing and the volumes that we have in Kildare. In last year, we processed over 15,000 non-PO invoices and over 18,000 purchase order invoices. We currently have about 10,000 active suppliers, and about 6,000 of those are trade suppliers, so that we could potentially get electronic invoices from. At the moment, about 80% of those invoices are coming in by email with attached PDFs, and 20% are still coming in by hard copy. We have 5.5 full-time staff in our finance department that are just working full-time on processing invoices and payments. And we have one full-time staff member that is just handles the invoices, and that's not processing them or getting them through to payment. That's literally just getting them ready to have them processed in the system. So that's about 380 invoices per week. So I suppose the issues that we saw with non-POs was the volume initially. Then across local authorities, thinking about it from a sectoral point of view, is the different ways that local authorities at the moment process their utility invoices. Some use direct debit, some have partial electronic processing, and I suppose that's what we do. We get a spreadsheet at the moment, and it goes through a system that we developed ourselves to try and handle them before they get into Agresso. And then other local authorities use purchase orders per department or by sub-department to pay their own department's non-PO invoices. There's also an issue on being able to manage the utility accounts. So apart from just the invoices, I think Martin talked about the MPRNs, who owns them, what department are they assigned to, what job and op codes should be used. And we found that people were kind of would pay a purchase order or pay a utility invoice by a purchase order, but when you ask them to put their hand up to say, this is my MPRN, I know exactly where it is, that was a bit more difficult. We have as well inconsistencies in the format of spreadsheets. So we do get spreadsheets from our utility companies at the moment and process them as a batch, but we do have issues with, the format change and nobody tells us, and we have to send it back and ask them to fix it. So there's no standardization, and that's just for us, that's not across all local authorities. So as part of the integration, the integration that has been delivered for non-POs in Agresso, the standard information which will be included on the electronic invoice. So if it's an electricity, it'll have an MPRN and an address. Mobiles will have the mobile number, and landlines will have the account number and the phone number. So in Agresso then, through the flexi fields, there's a new tab on the supplier master file which allows us to manage the details of the utility account. So if it's an MPRN, what the MPRN is, what job and op code should be used to pay it. And as was mentioned earlier, we have built in a threshold so that we can manage the invoices that come in below a certain threshold. So if it is a mobile number and at €20 the threshold, once it's under that, it will just go for payment and nobody has to see it. If it's an MPRN, a threshold is set for that, and again, if it's under that threshold, it'll automatically go for payment. If it's above that, it will go into the existing workflow like a purchase order invoice would that has exceeded the purchase order amount, so that somebody is alerted to the fact that, the bill is much more expensive than it normally would be, and is there a reason for that, and am I happy to pay it? So just on the accounts payable on the purchase order, so that's the non-purchase order side. So on the purchase order side, I'm just going to go through, I suppose, what our staff currently do and how we see that e-invoicing might change that and streamline that. So our one person that handles the 380 invoices a week, they check to see that all incoming invoices have a purchase order number, and they look up the supplier ID. Where the invoice has been emailed, it's printed and date stamped, and that's for prompt payments. The invoices are then just physically put in a batch for processing by all AP staff. The RCT invoices are separated out, and they're checked to make sure that the supplier ID and the RCT number is correct. So those invoices then are prepared and I suppose ready to be put into the system and to be matched. So all the AP staff then will process those invoices. So they'll scan the stamped invoice into Agresso and manually match it against the purchase order. If it's valid, it'll go for payment at that stage. If it has withholding tax, that's indicated on the matching screen. If it's not year-end, it'll go back in the workflow to be year-end before it goes for payment. The AP staff will then investigate any other anomalies, if it's a duplicate invoice number, if there's a problem with VAT, and then a hard copy of the invoice is filed by transaction number. That takes up 4 archive boxes per week. And some invoices would come in through departments as well. So there potentially those invoices, hard copies of those invoices are also being stored in the departments. And they are, every couple of weeks or months, are hauled off to storage. So you can do the maths on that, but that's a lot. That's over 200 boxes a year just on copies of invoices. So the integration that's been delivered in Agresso as part of the project that we did, we now have an access point provider which provides a portal for suppliers to submit and manage their invoices. It will validate the invoice based on that, on our SIS or our data model. And for PO invoices, that means that a purchase order has to be included or number, or it will be rejected straight away. The invoice then will be converted to our format for Agresso, which is EIO2, and transferred to our local instance of Agresso. The Agresso then will attempt to match the invoice number to the purchase order. And either by line or by summary, it will try to match the amount. So there's error handling in there to check if there's an issue with the invoice. So if the PO number is invalid, it'll go back to the supplier and AP will be notified. If it's imported and there's errors, there are Intel agent alerts to notify people what those issues are so that they can be resolved. There's a new relation that's set on the supplier. So when we talked about trying to deal with RCT and PSWT, we came to the conclusion that all RCT invoices and withholding tax invoices need to be screened by somebody to check that they're correct, because it seems that a lot of invoices would come in and withholding tax hasn't been declared, or there may be an RCT number on an invoice, but that supplier may have more than one RCT contract, and so the RCT number may be incorrect. So we have a new relation on the supplier. So if we set the relation on the supplier that it may be subject to withholding tax or RCT, they automatically go to a workflow so that accounts payable staff will look at them to make sure that they're correct. And around all the integration, we have Intel agents alerts to make sure that any scenario that we have thought of, and we've tested this quite thoroughly, whether it's year end, not year end, if the PO isn't there, if it's successful or not successful, that there is a mechanism built in to route that somewhere so that it can be, the issues can be resolved. So I don't know whether you can see that well, but this just sort of goes through, I suppose, the savings that we see from implementing e-invoicing. So that dedicated AP person, just even the purchase order number and the supplier ID will be checked automatically when the invoice is transferred to our local Agresso. So that kind of removes that step completely. The date for prompt payments will be determined by the date that the electronic invoice is received at the access point. So that negates having to print off the invoice. We've no physical invoices, so they don't need to be batched. As is currently the case, the RCT and PSWT invoices will be screened, but there is a mechanism for doing that. All the AP staff then that are currently processing the invoices, if the invoice is imported and it matches against the purchase order, then it automatically goes for payment. And in that scenario, there doesn't have to be any manual intervention at all with the invoice. If it has PSWT or RCT, that will be flagged and will be routed to accounts payable to be checked. As with investigating any of the anomalies, if there are anomalies with VAT as part of the checks that are done in Agresso, then they will be reviewed by AP staff as they currently would be. The hard copy, the electronic invoice is deemed the original invoice, so there's no need for storage of hard copies. So I suppose you're asking, and we've been asking, is e-invoicing the answer to our problems? So I suppose we see that it will definitely help to streamline our processes, reduce scanning and printing, which would free up one full-time person. But we also identified that the issues that we have currently in our purchase-to-pay cycle with manual invoices are only going to be replicated with e-invoicing if we don't look at those issues as part of this. So we see the real value if we can address the issues that we have and then start looking at onboarding suppliers. So some of the issues that we identified, and our Agresso support team in Kildare have done a huge amount of work after the pilot project ended on trying to get their procedures and their processes improved before e-invoicing kind of takes off. So some of the issues that have been identified, that there are too many staff raising requisitions in departments without the required knowledge. So they're just being handed and asked to create a purchase order for something, but they're feeling their way around. They're maybe using the manual, and they don't quite get the problems that bad quality POs cause down the line. Staff turnover in departments is a problem as well, where there has been a lot of movement in local authorities in recent years, and maybe the experienced person goes, they train somebody else up, and they don't get quite the full picture. There's also been an issue with face-to-face training immediately, so people are raising POs and requisitions before they've had proper training. There's no ownership of the process in departments, so they see it as an AP kind of function, and once they get the PO raised, that's kind of their job done. So there's a lack of quality on requisitions when it comes to codes, RCT numbers, and the descriptions are not great. So at the moment, discrepancies are resolved at the last possible opportunity. And that's when the invoice comes in and accounts payable are trying to get the invoice paid before the prompt payments deadline. Sometimes, because it's left until that stage, invoices have to be pulled at the last minute to allow the payment run to go through. Department ignore workflow tasks. Again, they don't see it as really being their issue. It's more an accounts payable issue. Workflow following people when they leave departments, and if there are complex orders, they can cause issues as well. So a lot of the issues that we see then on the invoices coming in really can go back to the lack of quality on the purchase order. So no PO number or the incorrect number, not a great description, no PSWT declared, the wrong RCT number or no RCT number, incorrect VAT rates. So that when you look at the issues on the invoices, they're the same as the purchase orders. So again, we need to look at those issues. So as part of the project, when the funded project ended, we started to look at how we can maybe use this as an opportunity to clean up our processes, and when we do start getting electronic invoices in volume, that more of them will be able to be matched off automatically, which will really free up resources in our finance department. So I suppose the challenges to making these improvements, there is work that needs to be done both on the process side, I suppose, and on the Agresso side. Your suppliers, if you're using Agresso, will have to be identified as RCT or PSWT for that relation to work. The email addresses for alerts or notifications for suppliers will be the same as what's currently being used for EFT remittances. Collating the information required to set up utilities is quite a big job, because we've done it in Kildare for our current e-invoicing, or our kind of half e-invoicing solution, and it did take a long time to do to get. We were collecting all the paper invoices as they came in, collecting the MPRNs, and then literally going out to the departments trying to find owners for them to get job and op codes that could be used to pay them. There is a potential change in work practices. At the moment, when a purchase order is raised, a lot of the time it's verbally communicated or communicated by email to suppliers. So we're looking to change that so that the actual purchase order will be issued to the supplier so that they have more detail when the invoice is coming in. Another challenge is securing the resources locally to get the buy-in to improve the processes that we have at the moment. And that involves a lot of buy-in, a lot of retraining in the departments, and a lot of cooperation from the departments. And incorporating e-invoicing into our day-to-day operations while the volumes are still low. And of course, onboarding suppliers is a challenge, given that we have 6,000, but we see great value as well in the utilities, if that's nearly 40% of all our invoices. So with 3 or 4 suppliers, we could make a good headway on that. So what we've done so far in Kildare, so the integration that's been delivered as part of the funded project has been implemented in our live environment in Kildare. The work that's been done by our Agresso support team is really starting to kind of get us ready to move to the next stage. So we've reduced the number of users raising requisitions from 248 to 114. So the first step was to reduce the number, and the second step is to retrain them so that the quality of purchase orders going out and then invoices coming in is much improved. So the key issues in raising the requisitions and POs have been identified, and since after Christmas, the Agresso support team have undertaken an intensive 5-week training schedule to retrain those 114 people who have been identified who are going to raise requisitions and POs in the departments. They've tailored it to specific departments so that everybody's talking about the same type of invoice rather than doing it across departments. They're also devising a training program for approvers to make them aware of what their responsibilities are. They're taking feedback from the users, so the issues that they're having, and trying to address those. At the moment, our Agresso training manual is quite meaty, and if you went about raising a purchase order with it's quite daunting. So the Agresso team are coming up with a checklist just to make it quick and easy for people, depending on the type of or purchase order that they're trying to raise, that they have the key information that they need. We have turned on mandatory attachments in Agresso so that there's more information provided on a purchase. Once the training has been completed, which I think is in the next week or two, we'll be adopting a zero tolerance in accounts payable for dealing with incomplete and incorrect invoices. So the fix-it by AP at the last minute will be a thing of the past, and all incorrect invoices will go back to the departments for them to feel the pain. The Agresso team are introducing a best practice for handling some of the more complex PO scenarios. So housing maintenance, where purchase orders could be quite complicated. They're trying to come up with a best practice for departments when they're creating the PO, so it makes them easier to process when the invoices come in. They're also working on functionality to allow purchase orders to be reviewed and forwarded from the Intel agent alert that comes from Agresso when a purchase order is approved. Improvements to the supplier entry module to improve the information that's set up on suppliers when they're being set up. And and they're doing some research on the supplier base to identify suppliers that are ready to go. So as was mentioned earlier, those suppliers that are being used by the ETBs, we're looking to see which of those suppliers are we using that, you know, they'll be ready to go, so they should be easier to onboard. We're also coming up with some internal KPIs to monitor the quality of purchase orders so that we can see where improvements are being made. For example, at the moment, 49% of our invoices are year-end after the invoice is received. So we'll be looking at trying to reduce that. So I suppose the benefits that we see from a local point of view, that we'll be getting consistent information on all invoices, we'll reduce the volume of paper that's received and processed and stored, and the costs associated with that. We'll provide utilities with a standard electronic format from all local authorities. As was mentioned earlier, if we can onboard one of the utilities and it's the same format for Kildare as it is for Meath or Monaghan or whatever, that makes it a much easier sell. From a local point of view, then we should have expert-trained super users that are raising POs and requisitions in Agresso, which will reduce the number of help desk queries that we get. And overall, it should free up resources that are currently required to process invoices to work on value-added activities. So I suppose that's where we are so far in Kildare. Our next steps really are to start looking at onboarding suppliers once we're happy that, you know, our processes are starting to improve. So thank you very much.